For the latest, our YouTube channel, click the bell icon for updates. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh, Revi, and on the gist today, we're looking at China's illegal maritime claims in the South China Sea and how the countries in that region are dealing with it. Our expert today is Bill Hayton. He's a well-known author of three seminal books on the region: The Invention of China, South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia and Vietnam. He's also an associate fellow at the Asia-Pacific program at Chatham House. Bill, thanks again for your time. Good to see you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Well, just getting straight into the subject, and I think it was in December when the Indonesian Maritime Agency, in fact, invited those 5 other countries that face the South China Sea for that conference, which is scheduled to take place in February. We presume it still will take place. What's your take on that? You have written on it in terms of how countries are dealing with China in the region, and do you see some kind of a change in how they're coming together?
I do. I think there's quite a lot that kind of feeds into that invitation from the Indonesian Maritime Enforcement Agency. And it's partly to do with China's behavior. I think it's also partly to do with some domestic things in Indonesia. There's a bit of rivalry between what's in effect the Coast Guard and the Navy about who's responsible for protecting the country's waters when it comes to situations like this. And the situation is that an Indonesian contract to drill close to the Natuna Islands, and they're down in the sort of bottom end of that U-shaped line you were just showing there, close to the mainland, or the main islands, you might say, of Indonesia. An Indonesian company was drilling there, and it was harassed by Chinese vessels, official Chinese Coast Guard vessels. So I think that has been the reason why this invitation was issued. I think that there might be a little bit of resistance to it, though, because Southeast Asian countries, in general, they like to work together through what's the consensus of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, all 10 countries together. And the idea of a small group of them, 6 of them, meeting together, not as ASEAN, but as South China Sea, is a bit sort of, kind of radical, really, for some of them. So this meeting may take place, and it would be a very, interesting, perhaps positive sign if it does take place. But I do wonder whether some of the other governments might be a bit reluctant to kind of publicly work together in this way.
Well, it's something that again has been made public in the Philippines by the defense secretary. There is the Russian and Indian joint collaboration supersonic missile, the BrahMos, and there has been an award of a contract, though we do hear that there's still nitty-gritties still to be formalized. And there are other countries in ASEAN, we hear Indonesia, Vietnam possibly, who are also in the queue. How important a development is the BrahMos batteries being supplied to Philippines when they go through?
Well, yes, it's interesting that you say that it hasn't, all gone through yet, because the a letter from the Philippines Defense Secretary was publicized, and it sort of appeared that there was a sort of, the deal had been done, and that Philippines was prepared to spend $340 million, if I remember rightly. It's a huge amount of money for the Philippines to spend. And I guess this is a way of trying to make Philippines defense, a bit more credible. I mean, their military, certainly at sea, is relatively weak compared to China's, for sure. And I guess the idea of having these very fast missiles, so there goes $374 million in effect. We're aware of bolstering it, but this it would probably have to be bolstered, based on the Philippines mainland, quite some way from the disputed parts of the sea. And of course, it's a sort of weapon of last resort. I mean, these missiles are designed to destroy ships. And obviously, if you're going to destroy a Chinese warship, you've got to be prepared for what comes next.
Yeah.
And so, it's a very interesting development for that sense. It's also interesting, I think, that the Philippines has jumped the queue. Vietnam has been talking to India and Russia about the BrahMos missile for a long time, much longer, I think. And yet they're still in the discussion stage, nothing yet announced. One of the theories about this is that China is resisting the sale, and has, previous reports around the sale of these missiles suggested that China was warning the Indian government that this would be a negative step from its perspective. So there's some quite delicate diplomacy, I think, going on here.
Sure. How do you see India in the region, in Southeast Asia, within the ASEAN, when the US and China are the two main players, and ASEAN, as you said, centrality, we don't really want to have to choose. India becoming a player along with Russia in this case. How do you see that developing?
I think for most Southeast Asian countries, the more outside powers that are interested, the better. They don't want to just, be sort of stretched between the US and China. And so the more options they have, the more partners they can work with, the better is their view. And India is, welcomed into the region, a large and capable power, but just far enough away that it can't be accused of, having its own interests, say in, maritime disputes, really, or, anything else. But then there's always been this gap between, the language of India, the look east, act east kind of language, and actually what happens on the ground. And so there's kind of, in a way, there's a desire for India to do more, and a bit of sort of maybe disappointment that India hasn't done as much as it could, I think, in lots of ways. And obviously, India has domestic constraints on it. The fact that India didn't join up to the big free trade area, to RCEP, was presumably more of a reflection on domestic Indian politics. But I think it was a kind of, a bit like when the US pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was a sort of a symbolic moment, which was, we know you have interests, but you're not able to overcome the domestic, resistance to further integration with this region.
There's an interesting comment from one of our viewers, Otsgur Chelik, who says the US State Department's Limit in the Seas paper makes a mockery of China's ridiculous claims in the South China Sea. He recommends everyone to read it. We'll put up some of those maps as well. Now, the report, as you've pointed out on social media, is quite thorough. It flows, of course, from the arbitration award that the Philippines won against China. If you could explain simply to us, China's so-called historical maritime claims and what this report is actually saying about its illegality.
Okay, so we have to be clear that we're talking about maritime claims and not territorial claims. So this isn't about who owns the rocks and the reefs in the South China Sea. It's about, in effect, what you can do in the spaces in between the rocks and the reefs. And there is an international treaty, UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which pretty much every country in the world agreed to back in 1982, and almost all of them have now ratified it. The big exception, of course, being the US, which hasn't ratified UNCLOS. But China and the Southeast Asian countries have. And in theory, UNCLOS says this is how you divide up the resources of the sea. You allowed an exclusive economic zone and a territorial sea. And, when, there are clashes, there are disputes, there are sort of rules about how you can, define the areas around your land features. Unfortunately, China, whilst in one sort of, breath is saying, yes, we support UNCLOS, at the same time, they're also saying, but we want things that go beyond UNCLOS. And the whole point of UNCLOS, this treaty, was to try to basically get rid of any other, kind of older historic claims, as it were, and to say these are the international rules for dividing up the fish and the oil and the gas. But around the time that China was debating whether, the ratification of UNCLOS back in the mid-1990s, it came under the influence of a professor from Taiwan, a guy called Fu Quanchen, who had these very strange ideas about what he called historic rights, that China should have the right to every fish and every drop of oil within the 9-dash line. Now, this 9-dash line was drawn originally with 11 dashes and printed on a map from China in 1948. And at the time, it only meant this is our claim to these rocks and reefs, to the islands. And even that was disputed. But in the 1990s, a couple of Taiwanese-based professors came up with the idea that this line should actually indicate a claim to all the resources of the sea, and came up with the idea that this was historic rights. And unfortunately, this claim was then incorporated into Chinese law, its law on the exclusive economic zone in 1998. And so ever since then, we've had this real problem that China has claimed rights that go beyond UNCLOS. And that really is the cause of the disputes to do with the oil and the gas and the fishing. If that wasn't there, then you could limit the disputes to just who owned the rocks and the reefs, and it would be less serious. So it's really messed up the South China Sea, this historic rights claim. And so this report from the US is a pushback against that and saying there is no basis for that.
A pushback, and now it's not something new. Like we're saying, it flows out from the arbitration award that the Philippines won. But if that is clear that China is not following the rules of the game, international law, what changes? I mean, how do you change China's behavior, or do they do what they want to do anyway?
It's interesting the way the Chinese government is sort of framing its response, which is it's trying to show that it's acting within international law. It's coming up with, interpretations of UNCLOS, the law of the sea, that nobody else agrees with, but it's trying to frame it as if it is legal, which I guess you say is a good sign, because it's, because on the other hand, China could simply kind of say, we don't care about international law, we've just got a bigger navy than you and we're going to do what we like. But it seems that it's more keen on presenting a legal and sort of, diplomatic, legitimate kind of face to the world. And so it's couching a lot of its arguments in this legal language. So it would dispute that it's illegal, but everybody else says, the way you're interpreting the law is wrong and unlawful. But of course, to publish a document and talk about the law is one thing, and to actually have the right, not necessarily the right, but the ability to fish and drill for oil and gas in the South China Sea according to the rules is something else. And obviously, China has, in the last 2 or 3 years, really prevented Vietnam, Malaysia, for sure, Vietnam from drilling for gas in particular, and has harassed Indonesian and Malaysian operations, and stopped the Philippines as well. So Philippines and Vietnam have really suffered. And Malaysia and Indonesia are starting to feel the heat. Brunei has been very quiet, but I think it's also come under a lot of pressure. So the real pushback will be when these countries are able to assert their rights under UNCLOS without fear of intimidation or worse from the Chinese side. And that's really what's lacking. Interestingly, Malaysia, while on the public level is tries to be friendly to China and but has been the most assertive in insisting that its oil and gas drills are going to go ahead. Indonesia, the same. Whereas, Vietnam and the Philippines, which have been more outspoken towards China, have been less willing to actually take the risk of pushing ahead with oil and gas development in what are their own exclusive economic zones, but which China disputes.
You have answered it, but linked to what you've been talking about is a question from one of our viewers, Matara, who I believe is based in the UK. What is the point of ratifying treaties? She asks if some countries are intent on disregarding it even after signing it. UNCLOS is disregarded, as are the climate treaties. Brexit is another example, but you get the point.
Yeah. I mean, well, I guess it's better than the alternative, really. Treaties do limit countries' behavior, at least they should do. And it's interesting that China is trying to say that what it's doing is within UNCLOS, although everybody else disputes it. So in that sense, it does limit China's behavior to a degree. When it comes to Brexit, I think you're absolutely right. Governments, our own government here in the UK, trying to wriggle out of its commitments. And of course, then other countries will take, retaliatory steps, as we've seen in the last few months. But the whole point of treaties is to make it clear what the limits on countries' behaviours are. The fact that the United States hasn't ratified UNCLOS, ironically, doesn't mean that it doesn't follow UNCLOS, because the US, and from the government side, recognises that UNCLOS is now the way that things are done, and behaves according to those rules. The problem is that the senators in the US Senate, they can't muster the 2/3 majority, the 67 votes that it's necessary to ratify it. So on one side, you have the US, which hasn't ratified UNCLOS, but basically follows its provisions. And on the other side, you have China, which has ratified, but is going against it in many practical ways.
So in essence, you're saying the US Senate not ratifying UNCLOS, is it diluting the US policy in any way?
Well, it certainly dilutes its moral authority. That's absolutely true. I mean, it's an easy thing for anybody, who wants to criticize, for example, this report that's just been published by the US, to say, well, you haven't ratified UNCLOS, so what do you care? What do you know about it? And that, every American official kind of has to sort of, look at their shoes at that point. But they always say that, even though the US hasn't ratified it, the US follows it in terms of the rules on navigation and maritime resources and that kind of thing.
Madara, thanks you for that answer, Bill. Now, again, just looking at the area, Cambodia is the chair of ASEAN now, and we've seen, already divisions about Myanmar coming up. But you've pointed out, I think, in one of your writings as well, what happened when Cambodia was chair 10, 12 years back, and Cambodia, Laos, maybe even Thailand, are countries that are seen as China creates that wedge among ASEAN countries, with these countries supporting China. So how do you see, the whole ASEAN centrality and developing with Cambodia as chair?
Yeah, it's going to be an interesting year. So 10 members of ASEAN, they each take a turn being chair for a year. So 10 years ago, Cambodia was in the chair. It goes alphabetically. So Brunei last year, Cambodia this year. And Cambodia has made a point, going back many years, of being very friendly to China. And this is partly because Cambodia has many differences with Vietnam, has their own maritime and territorial disputes in the Gulf of Thailand, apart from other things. And there's a kind of historic antagonism between sort of Khmer and Viet people that goes back a long way. And so there's always been a bit of sort of my enemy's enemy is my friend in Chinese, Cambodian, Vietnam triangle. And the Cambodians have been very friendly and under Hun Sen towards China. But I think a lot of this can be explained by what the Cambodian government kind of wants at the moment. And really for Hun Sen, he's a strongman leader, one of the longest serving leaders in the world. And he basically wants a smooth succession to his son to take over from him. And so therefore, everything else is secondary to that. And if that means kind of, development aid from China and therefore kind of, being more, friendly towards China, then that's what he'll do. and this has upset many of the other members of ASEAN who say, you should be focused on what's good for your own, your country, for the region, for Southeast Asia. And the idea that you're going to do China's bidding is against the spirit of what ASEAN is. And this caused big upsets 10 years ago in 2012, when in the ASEAN summit, Cambodia was basically seen to do the bidding of China and to prevent an agreement. ASEAN is very focused on the idea of consensus, that all the 10 countries need to come to an agreement and they should stick to that agreement. Sometimes that means they can only come to a very weak agreement, but nonetheless, you keep to an agreement. And so I think the other ASEAN countries will push back towards Cambodia on this. And they will say, well, these are the statements that ASEAN has made in the past on this issue on South China Sea. And so therefore, we've got to stick to that same framework now as a means of trying to prevent Cambodia diluting it. Now, the one big issue facing ASEAN and China on the South China Sea is the fate of what's called the Code of Conduct. And China and the ASEAN countries have been talking about a code of conduct for more than 20 years. And they basically can't agree. There are lots of specific things they can't agree on, but fundamentally, the Southeast Asian countries want to constrain China's behavior, and China doesn't want its behavior constrained, and so they're locked in this deadlock. But they've talked about getting an agreement done by the end of this year. Cambodia is in the chair, is more friendly towards China, and so you've seen some comments from the Chinese side, sort of, we're looking forward to a speedy end to the code of conduct, and the Vietnamese and Philippines and other countries are worried that this might be an opportunity when Cambodia tries to dilute this code of conduct, have it much less kind of strong when it comes to China's behavior, and do China's bidding. So that's kind of what some of the background noise is to these discussions at the moment.
And Bill, if you want to take this question from 1 to 4, just madness, why is ASEAN unable to put up a united front against China? Is it because of the diaspora, economy, or differing interests among member states, with mainly maritime nations opposing and continental nations with China?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to remember that ASEAN, it really is, it's an association of these 10 separate countries. It's much less integrated than, say, for example, the European Union. And you still have countries with very strong senses of their own self-interest and nationalism. And as the questioner was saying, different relations with China. You have the sort of 6 countries with direct interest in the South China Sea, so Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, the Philippines, Singapore, and Brunei. And then you have the sort of more mainland countries who are looking the other way, so Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, whose relationship is not so closely connected to the South China Sea. And obviously within that, Myanmar is isolated, it has the military coup, and is looking for support from wherever it can go, and it may be leading more towards China. Laos is on the Chinese border, and is kind of gradually being pulled into China's orbit. You saw the opening of the China-Laos railway, which connects Laos very strongly to China these days. And even Thailand, although it's formally a US security ally, the coup has strained relations with the US, and we're starting to see the sort of Thailand kind of moving in a bit more of a sort of China-friendly direction than it certainly used to have maybe 10 years ago. So you're kind of starting to see the opening of a rift within the organization, and that will worry ASEAN. They will try and double down, I think, to try and pull the organization back together to be a sort of cohesive whole. But yeah, trading relations with China and the US and other countries will be different in each case, and political relations. And you have to remember this, foreign policy isn't made by ASEAN. It's made by each of the 10 governments separately. The actual budget of ASEAN and the number of officials it employs is far, far smaller than, say, for example, in the European Union. Much less sense of a kind of a Southeast Asian identity, still very much a strong set of national identities.
Right. I'm just going to take one last question from Matara, who says, just like you already done the BrahMos one. How feasible is it for China to make artificial islands into military bases? I think already in progress. And if you want to, give us a roundup of how you see pushback against China developing in the near future.
Well, the most significant thing about these artificial island bases that China has built, and it's built 3 very large ones that have runways on, and then 4 smaller ones in the Spratly Islands. And then in the northern part of the South China Sea, in the Paracel Islands, it has other bases. But these new bases in the southern part of the South China Sea, although they have a military purpose, they also have a kind of civil purpose, and they have been able to support China's Coast Guard and maritime militia vessels to have an almost permanent presence in these disputed areas down in the South China Sea. And it's these civilian or paramilitary rather than military forces which are doing most of the work in terms of harassing the oil and gas drilling and the fishing operations by the Southeast Asian countries. And by having these artificial harbors down there, that's given China this near permanent presence. And there's nothing that, say the United States or Japan or even the Southeast Asian countries can do that can match that. And that's really what the pushback, where that needs to come is actually on the day-to-day management of fishing resources and oil and gas and energy resources. And at the moment, China is in the process of establishing a veto within the 9-dash line and basically saying nothing is going to happen here unless we say it happens. And that will mean that, in effect, what China calls joint development, which I think the Southeast Asians would say would be unfairly stealing their resources.
Bill Hayton, absolutely appreciate your time, your experience, and all your thoughts. Thanks for answering some of those questions that were taken, and thanks again for coming on StratNews Global.
It's been a great pleasure. It's a really good experience. Thanks for your questions, and Joe, great hosting.
The pleasure has been all ours. Bill Hayton joining us from London. And just a reminder to our viewers, if you haven't already subscribed to our YouTube channel, do that. If you like this video and our other videos, do share the links so that we get more views. And just putting out a link which will, if you're interested in supporting us financially, there is a link that's there in our YouTube channel as well. Thanks everybody for watching and participating. This is The Gist on StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.